Well, hey everybody, long time no see nor hear, but welcome once again to the Everyday Missionary Podcast. This is episode 305, and I have not cast a pod into the interwebs now for a few weeks. Been busy with a number of things, like we did one at the beginning of the month, and then just got busy with all kinds of stuff. I mean, literally, I almost feel like I'm run ragged here as I'm rolling into the end of the month. I mean, even yesterday I had tons of stuff I was doing. And so part of it has just been, I've been so busy that when I get to these moments where I think I'm going to be able to do a podcast, I either don't have the space or don't have the energy. And so I've just kept punting week after week. But there was also reality that there was tons of stuff that I wanted to talk about. And then I'm like, but do I really want to talk about that? Because here's the thing. I think people kind of assume that I take great joy in saying things that are bothersome, or I like to be provocative for provocative sake. And that's actually not it. I can legitimately say that is not my heart in any of it. Like, I don't look and I go, oh, how can I stir up some strife and cause some problems today for people? Like, that's not really my heart. But what I so much try to do in the podcast, or even with what I do on Sunday mornings or whatever, but more probably with the podcast, is I'm trying to kind of navigate how our faith informs our daily living, how our faith informs our families, our sexuality, our politics, our money, our relationships, our occupation, whatever it is. Like, I'm trying to do that because the everyday missionary is, in fact, just that thing. Like, how do we every day live Jesus in the world that we live in with all of its messiness and problems and questions and everything else? And then a lot of that is then using whatever's happening as kind of a tool to go, like, what would Jesus do in this space? And what is contrary to Jesus in this space, right? Like, that's a lot of the heart of this whole podcast. So when I deal with certain topics that are maybe like culturally relevant or things that are going on, part of that is to say, great, let's look at that through the lens of being a follower of Jesus. And in that, also realizing that we're all creatures of our environment. We all come to life with certain preconceptions and biases, and we live in different like tribes that emphasize some things and devalue other things and say this is the rule for this and this is the anti-rule for that. Like, that's super normal. And so then what I'm trying to do is say, like, hey, but are we getting kind of contaminated? Are we losing the forest for the trees? Are we getting more informed by earthly things, but then trying to take those things and use them in the defense of Jesus, when in fact Jesus is like, he's like, that's nothing like me that you're doing. And therefore we need to look at that and highlight that. Like, that's a lot of kind of what I care about here. And so much of today's podcast is going to be dealing with some of that stuff. I get it. It's tender. It's problematic. People are very divided on different things, but I really do want to go like, and what is the Jesus way? Because that's really what matters. And I'm convinced that increasingly, in some sectors of my shared evangelicalism, because that's the other thing I want to say. This podcast is to evangelicals. It's not to disbelievers. It's not to Catholics. It's not to Eastern Orthodox. It's not to agnostics. It's not to whatever. It's to my tribe, right? Like, I'm trying to figure out how I lead and guide and model Jesus to my tribe. If I was in a different tribe, I'd be talking about different stuff, right? That's another thing I think some people miss sometimes. They're like, why are you always talking about like conservative politics, for example? And I'm like, because that's mostly my tribe. Like, that's like 90% of my tribe is that. And so that's what I want to speak to. I'm not looking to speak to mainline churches or liberal problems, because that's just not the crew that I'm running with. Again, if I was there, I'd be talking about how Jesus needs to reshape those perspectives, but I'm talking about where Jesus needs to continue to reshape our perspectives and how maybe we're kind of getting baited into mishandling or misthinking about certain things within our society. And it's easy to do because there's all kinds of voices that make all kinds of money to try to rile up all sorts of strife and cause us to be less like Jesus, when we should more than ever be trying to be most like Jesus in our world. That's a lot of the stuff that I really, really care about. And so just want to highlight that, because there's a number of things we're going to talk about today, because I think what I did is I kept thinking about different topics, and I'm like, am I ready to talk about it? Probably not. Let me think it through more. And then by the end, I'm like, okay, now I've got like a bunch of topics. I'll just do them all together in one podcast, and then that way we'll get the pain out of the way as rapidly as possible, because I think that's what is important. I think the other thing that's important here actually goes to our kind of our mission statement as a church, right? So at Redemption Church, where I'm the pastor, we talk about helping people believe life is better with Jesus. And the essence of that, it's not an evangelistic motto. It's really a discipleship motto. And it's kind of built in such a way that, like, my heart is to get Christians believing that the way Jesus prescribes life to be lived is in fact better. Like, that they would have a conviction. They would believe that when he says to do these things, that doing those things are better for the enrichment of life, both for yourself, certainly, but for the lives of people around you, the people that hate you or the people that love you. It doesn't matter. When you do it Jesus' way, when you take his message seriously, his kind of methodology for doing daily life, when you really do those upside down and backwards things, it's in fact better. And we need to believe that, as opposed to we give it lip service, but we don't do it. That's probably a lot of also then the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. And then from that, kind of giving us that challenge, it says, don't get baited by the stuff of the world in the name of Jesus. No, you enter into the space of the world with the stuff of Jesus, doing the counterintuitive stuff of Jesus. And that's actually then how witness takes place. That's how kingdom expansion takes place. It doesn't come by way of force. It comes by way of persuasion. It comes by way of example. It comes by way of being very different than what's anticipated in the world, right? Because the world uses force and manipulation and all these things, thuggery to get stuff done. That is how we're to be fundamentally different, right? So there's the preamble to what I'm getting at today and everything else. But before I do it, I want to give a shout out to something. And I did this on social media a few weeks ago. And since then, I keep listening to this particular podcast. And frankly, I am loving it. I am loving it for reasons that are multifaceted. But let me just give you the lowdown on it. So it's called Lights On. It's with Carl and Laura Lentz. If you are not familiar with that name, or maybe the story, maybe you are, maybe you're not, or maybe it'll jog a memory when I say it. But Carl was the lead pastor at Hillsong Church in New York City. And a few years ago, big scandal, big blow up, like he was having an affair, actually had more than one affair. There was a lot of talk about abusive leadership. There was some concern about some drug or substance abuse in Carl's world, which was true. And so it was this very public kind of eruption of one of many just evangelical leaders blowing up, right? That's just been almost a weekly occurrence right now. Like, it's just really, really wild how that's happening. And again, all of that goes back to people that aren't taking Jesus seriously, but they're doing stuff in Jesus's name, but not with Jesus's heart, certainly not with Jesus's leadership over their lives. And so these things are happening. So anyway, big, huge public thing, right? And then since then, there's been some documentaries. All of Hillsong has been kind of like melting down. There's just a lot to it. Anyway, what I love is now, like 4 years later, Carl and his wife have managed to rescue their marriage. He's faced his addictions, and they are literally unpacking their journey for the last 4 years. And I think it's awesome. Like, I really do. And here's part of why I love this. I would say I can't think of a time when a pastor blew up in ministry and returned not to be a pastor, but to walk through and publicly kind of reveal all the work that it's taking to bring healing to their own individual lives, their marriage, their family, everything else. And so, like, Carl's not going back into pastoral ministry or anything like that. He's just trying to say, like, hey, here's what I learned. Here's what I did. Here's how you can not make the same mistakes I did. Or if you're making the same mistakes, here's how you need to course correct it before it blows up in your face, because it will blow up in your face. And it's just a really authentic, open communication. And part of what I love about it is it's not... I think there's this thing sometimes within Christianity where it's like you need to grovel for the rest of your life if you failed. And there was certainly, as I kind of put out there, like, hey, listen to this podcast, people are like, almost like he's not groveling enough. He's not just perpetually like in this state of radical mourning. And I go, yeah, why would he? That is not kind of the tone of the scriptures when you read that. Like, you think about, like, David did some bad stuff, like way worse than Carl Lentz. Like, David did some really rotten stuff, right? But the amount of verses we have on his repentance is not that many. I mean, we're not talking like 50 verses. You know, we're talking like a psalm about it and a little bit of stuff in Samuel. Like that's all you really get. And then it's over. Like, you know, it's like he laments for a week and it's kind of over, you know. And I don't mean to diminish failure and sin and infidelity and all. That's not the thing. But I think there is almost, again, like this tone that's like, you know, in every episode, if Carl isn't just weeping and talking about how he's a dirty dog, like then he isn't really sorrowful for his sin. Now, I actually, as I listen, I go, this is a dude taking a lot of ownership, and he uses a lot of different words in that. And that's the other thing. People are like, oh, he calls it, you know, I made mistakes, or I mishandled my private life, and it's sin, right? And I'm like, well, sin means to miss the mark, so it doesn't have quite the teeth that we sometimes like to give it. Like we like to give certain religious words teeth, right? Like repent, like it's this really bitey word. And then in Greek, you're like, metanoeo, it means to think differently, change your mind about how you've been doing stuff. And so if he said, I changed my mind, we would go, oh, that's not serious enough. But if he says, I repented, we'd say, oh, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. And I'm like, well, they mean the same thing. They're the same. Man, sorry, sidebar. I'm getting off on something because, again, it's been recent conversations where I'm having with people that we kind of in our doctrinal world load up our words. But when you get into the scriptures and what those words really communicate, there's different tones in there. And I think that's important to realize. And so I think even with Carl, you know, he talks about mistakes and he talks about mismanagement and mishandling, but he also talks about sin and repent and evil and vice and addiction and all these things. And so anyway, just putting it out there, it's really, I think, a very enlightening podcast, especially for anybody that has done anything stupid in their life. And certainly anybody that's done anything stupid and it was made public, I think it's very valuable. But I also think for anybody that's doing anything currently in their life that's stupid, you should listen to that because it's really good. And I think even for people that have been wounded by the people in their life that are doing foolish things, sinful things, closeted things that now are on their doorstep or whatever else, I think Laura's message in this podcast is as beautiful and interesting and like almost like disciple-ish, you know, in that way. And so I'm just putting it out there. So I'm going to try to be more cognizant on the podcast of like, hey, here's something that's cool that I'm listening to or reading, and certainly kind of passing it your way. I've done that before, kind of forgotten about it, and trying to do it again. So anyway, great podcast. Every episode I can't wait for. Like right now I'm watching Star Wars, The Acolyte, or The Acolyte, summer. I'm not like excited for every episode. Like I can't wait till next week. At least so far I'm not. But this podcast, very excited about that. So anyway, that's a freebie because you showed up. But now let's get into some of the topics that have been rummaging around in society for the last few weeks, things that I've been thinking about talking about. And I want to start with the one that I actually posted something on social media right around the time it happened. But it's this new Louisiana mandate for the 10 Commandments, right? And I kind of put it out there and I'm like, hey, man, listen, as an evangelical, this is a bad idea. And as I've thought about it more, I've thought, it's doubly a bad idea, right? And for a number of reasons, right? And some of those are going to be, I think it's a bad idea to the way our founders kind of set stuff up, because whether you like it or not, the 10 Commandments, I know the governor kind of has the mindset that says, hey, these are the archetype of law, and therefore, because we are a society of laws, and this is the archetype that we use to form our laws, we should be putting this in our classrooms. So it's like, it's not really a religious thing exactly, or mandating a single religion, because part of the argument has been both Christians and Jews agree on this document, and therefore it's not any one religion that's being highlighted, because if two groups agree, then apparently it's not some kind of violation. But here's the thing about this, right? So a number of things about this really quick. Kind of the first off thing of this is the fact that I think it's odd that we really have always had this quest to want the 10 Commandments to be displayed as some kind of model of law giving. It not that it isn't, but when you look at the things that are there, many of them aren't about social dynamic or social structure, right? So like the first three are very much about, for no better way of putting it, doctrine, right? So you can only have this one God. You can't use his name in vain. You can't make any images of this God that Israel follows, right? So automatically the first three are legislation about theology. They're not legislation about morality in that sense. And not that I'm taking away from that. I love the book of Exodus. I love the book of Deuteronomy, both of which have the 10 commandments, slightly different between the two, but have the list of the 10. But the first three, you go like, that's not really fundamentally about civic law in any kind of context. The fourth commandment then is keeping the Sabbath, right? And it's like, how does that kind of play into society's kind of social contract and agreement from a legal perspective? Does that mean that we make sure everything's shut down on Saturdays? Because that's the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't Sunday. The Sabbath isn't just any day of the week you choose to rest. No, the Sabbath was a thing that every single person in the community abided by this thing. And so everything should be closed. Everything should be shut down. No food should be cooked. No games should be watched. No soccer matches should be played. Like, all of that would be the keeping of Sabbath, right? And so the first four don't really fit the social contract. As you go through the others, you know what, like bearing false witness is a legal thing, but it's only for a court of law. It's not about lying per se. That's an extension we make out of it, but that's not what that's really all about. The coveting one, the last of the commandments, is a heart thing more than an action thing. And for the most part, that's exactly what it's getting at. Adultery, I don't know how to break it to anybody, even though I guess maybe we should make it illegal, but it's not illegal. And so, again, this is a weird place to go in my mind for what the purpose of the 10 commandments was, to be like, oh, this is just emphasizing the importance of civic law and community agreement. And that's kind of why they're there, to remind of that, because that's not exactly what the 10's function was in the nation of Israel. It was a covenant between them and God. And inside of that covenant, there's another thing that I think gets lost, which is it's not very useful to post laws without posting, and this is the consequence for the violation of these laws, right? And so maybe that's the other thing about posting the 10 commandments. It's almost like they're just turning into icons that we don't really mean anything by it. We just want the iconic thing on the wall to make a point, but we're not really taking any of it very seriously in the way it was given to Israel. Because when it was given to Israel, many of those things in the 10, the consequence for violation was execution. So I kind of laughed. I mean, this is just me a little bit because I'm just twisted that way. But when I saw that day and I was posting on social media, I almost put an extra line in my thing that said, but I guess liberals could be excited about this if evangelicals are serious about this, because it would solve their Donald Trump problem, right? Because according to the code, Donald Trump should have been executed a long time ago, actually, for his infidelity. Like, I don't think anybody's debating the infidelity. And I go, yeah, and the 10 commandments are clear. You don't commit adultery. And what is the consequence for that in the code of Moses? Execution. So it's like, but we're not really taking these 10 commandments seriously in that sense. We're not tethering their consequence to their code. Same with honoring your father and mother. We see in Deuteronomy, if you don't, the parents take the kid to the elders of the gate and they kill him, Or if you don't keep the Sabbath, dudes were executed for not keeping the Sabbath. There's rules about if you're gathering sticks on the Sabbath, you die, man. You're going down. You make an image of God, you're dying, you're going down. So much of this, right? I just kind of look and I go, it really doesn't... In doing it, not only does it not honor what the code was in the Hebrew scriptures, it's not taking it very seriously. It's just, again, another gotcha. It's another thing to just make another group mad, which was even the heart. Like when the governor comes out and he's like, I can't wait to get sued, right? Like he knew what he was doing, It's just virtue signaling for his side of the aisle, for his people or constituency, and it kind of has this feel of the nationalism problem I'm going to get into in a minute. But I just, for all of that, I'm like, man, this is not helping the cause of Jesus. This is hurting the cause of Jesus. And that's, again, all of this I'm going to talk about today comes back to that. Nobody thought this is a win for Jesus. Because it's not even the Christian Testament. It's the Old Testament, man. Like, if you wanted to do something that was really cool for Jesus and they said, hey, we want to put up the great commandment to love God and love your neighbor, that's at least getting kind of closer to the pin, right? Or my argument was, if you're going to post something, man, post like the Sermon on the Mount. Like, that is something that is beautiful and life transforming and everything else. The law, Paul says, brings death, man, right? But Jesus and truth and grace brings life. Like, it's just like I go, it's not thought through theologically. It's not thought through kingdom wise. It's just, again, it's a stick to poke the left and to make a point that loses Jesus in the midst of that, right? And so there's a lot more I could say about that. But again, I'm going to try to hit a number of things today. But for all of this is sort of a win for Christianity, right? Or the memes that are out there about, oh, you can't post this, but you can put this in the library of a public school or whatever else. I'm like, stop it. Just stop it. Because again, the thing we're meant to do here is represent Jesus well. And when we do these kind of antics or tricks or just showboating things, it does the opposite of highlighting Jesus well. It really does. It kind of misses the point. I think another thing, just as a fun freebie, is one of the things a lot of people don't realize, and this was kind of the governor's point when he said, hey, this is, if we're going to be a society of laws, this is the root of all laws. Technically, that's not true. We have legal codes that existed before the time of Moses that Moses incorporates into his legal code. So the idea that the code of Moses, whether it be in Exodus, Leviticus, or Deuteronomy, a little bit's in Numbers too, but the idea that was all original, had never seen life in the world until Moses penned those things, or God gave all of that to Moses. A lot of that stuff we've already proven, like, no, man, the Code of Hammurabi, there's other things out there, some of the laws of Egypt. Moses just grafts in to his work. Now, there are some things that are original, and some of the Ten Commandments, I would argue, are original to codes, but others are very familiar to the code. So in some ways, if we really wanted to say we want to go to the original law of all things, we'd have to go back further than the Old Testament, because there was laws before the Old Testament that the Old Testament borrows, right? So there's a kind of a biblical scholarship reality right there. And not that that's bad or wrong. Like, this is the thing. Sometimes people like, well, if it isn't original to us, then it isn't true. Or if he borrowed it from someplace else, that's a problem. I'm like, no, it's not. Moses was a man of his time. God commissioned him to lead a nation, to create not only covenantal agreement, but also just civil order. And much of Moses' civil order was borrowed from the stuff that was around him. Like, that wasn't crazy in any sense. And I think that's kind of cool. Like, God is all about like revealing things in the world, sometimes outside of his kind of community of faith, and oftentimes inside his community of faith. And that's just kind of the way it works. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, like I said, I think it needs to be more about Jesus, less about Moses, because again, law brings death, Jesus brings life. And this whole thing is actually, I think, it just smells like death. You know what I mean? More than smells like life. Like the powers that be that wanted to set this up and do this, they weren't thinking like, man, this is how we're going to showcase Jesus. I think it was more like, man, this is how we're going to make some people mad, And I'm like, as soon as that's the way you're looking at it, that's not a healthy thing, right? Especially if you are of a persuasion that says we're supposed to be bringing Jesus to people so that people can follow Jesus. Like, if that is your persuasion too, then why would you want to use a stick? I mean, really, a carrot is much more effective, and this is way more stick than it is carrot. So anyway, that's the first thing. Maybe, I guess, technically the second thing after I talked about the podcast. The third thing, though, tonight, my friends, is the first debate between two very, very, very elderly gentlemen. And Ellen and I joked, we're going to watch it tonight, and we're trying to figure out what buzzwords we use to make it a drinking game. I'm not sure what it's going to be yet. Because, and I want to be careful here, because again, even what I just said there was like borderline snarky. I'm going to be doing a message at the end of July on respecting the elderly in our culture, and now I said that. That's my sin. I confess that right now. That was not the smartest thing for me to say, but I'm not going to edit it out, because again, you should see when I sin, and then I also confess when I sin. So, but it is going to be an interesting debate, because again, for me as an orator or communicator, I would say that the two candidates that are before us are not great orators. Like they don't communicate ideas super well anymore. Like I see old footage of Joe Biden. I think he really did that. I see old footage of Donald Trump way back in the day. I think he actually did that. I think today I go, it's odd that these are the two best options that we have for our society, because I don't think they capture or communicate ideas well. And so I'm not really expecting to get like a really awesome showcase of civics and a plan for the future that's cogent and clear. It's just, I think it's going to be like this slight dumpster fire rap battle, if you will, with people that maybe aren't really great rappers. Like I think it's going to come down to that, right? And so it should be interesting. But I want to talk about not so much, the debate tonight, and really, not so much even what political side you fall on or whatever else. But I have been thinking a lot more about how there is a segment of our evangelical world that is kind of like, it reminds me of what Jesus says, like, hey, what good is it if you gain the whole world but you lose your soul? And it seems like there is like a willingness on the part of a good segment of my fellow evangelicals that is willing to and wanting to gain the political world, even if it means kind of losing their Jesus-centric soul in the process. And I do think where that is most highlighted and showcased is, and I'm going to be clear here, I have absolutely no disagreement whatsoever with anybody that says, you know what, I vote Republican every time because that's my party, that's my platform, that's just the route I go, those are the policies I agree with. It really doesn't even matter the body behind the R. I'm just going to vote the R because that's my conviction. I have zero problem with that. I really have zero problem with that, where it's just like that's just the formula I use. As much as I don't have a problem with somebody who says, I just go the D every time. I only vote Democrat straight across the board. I never consider otherwise. Doesn't matter the person. I just go that route because each of these things represent an ideology, and I'm loyal to the ideology, or I believe the ideology is best, and I just stick with that regardless of who's running that ship at the time, right? I actually totally get that. I can actually really even appreciate that, because in some ways it's no different than a lot of other places of conviction that we people have, right? So if you have conviction about like a certain kind of doctrinal viewpoint, that oftentimes may be something that transcends persons, even the persons that formulated the doctrinal viewpoint, right? So like we're Protestants. Luther is the guy that did it. Luther as an individual was kind of a mess to me. Like I'm not really a big like Martin Luther fan. Like the guy I don't think is a great guy, but I'm loyal to the essence of theology that he birthed, right? Even though I think it came maybe even from a guy with some poor character, I still hold to that, right? So in that sense, I'm like, yeah, I'm Protestant, even though the dude that kind of founded it and some of the dudes around it, I don't know what I think about them totally. So I get that part, right? Now I'm starting to ramble. Let me get to the core of it. But there's this other thing that's going on, and I think it is this odd defense of almost like a celebration of President Trump that I think in the process of that, it undermines witness, I think, for us. But also it's weird how there is just this willingness to like turn blind eye or to say, like, we're going to hold others to a standard, but we're going to kind of let it slide with him. And I think there's a reason why that's happening. I'll get to that in a minute. But matter of fact, this week there was an interesting article in Christianity Today that basically, and it was Russell Moore. So again, he's a kind of a never President Trump kind of person. He's like, I'll never vote for the guy because we would have never voted for this kind of person historically as evangelicals. We would have never gone down this road. There was things that led to it. And again, I'm going to get to that in a minute. But we would have never historically supported somebody of this kind of character. Vindictive, multiple infidelities. I mean, even the thing that recently happened with his felony convictions, you know, I know there's a lot of people saying that was a rigged and that was a sham. And I think it's really hard to rig a jury court. You know, it's a different game. You know, there was all of that. But I don't know of anybody that's saying like, oh, Yeah, and I don't think he had sex with a porn star. Like, I think everybody's like, no, he probably had sex with a porn star. But come on, man, is this really a felony level thing that he tried to pay some money to keep her from sharing the story? Like, I think everybody just goes, yeah, the guy, he has a lot of sexual issues, right? But Russell Moore's article, this was the bitey part at the beginning of it. He said, how did he put it exactly? Like, had President Trump realized that evangelicals just don't care that he has sex with a porn star, he could have saved himself the money, right? Like, the reason he was paying it off was mainly because he was concerned about the Christian rights viewpoint on him having sex with a porn star. And so he needed to get that story under wraps so that we didn't judge him for it. In the end, it comes out. He's got all these felonies related to it now. And then the response of many evangelicals is literally like outrage that like he was busted for it, outrage that he's being blamed for a thing, though we all kind of go like, he probably did the thing. Like, this is the weirdest part to me. And so Russell Moore's thing was just hilarious, where he's just like, had Trump realized we just weren't going to care. Like, we talk ethics, but we don't care if it's our guy. Like, if our guy's breaking the rules, we don't care. He's like, he could have saved himself all the hassle in the world if he just realized this is our real character as evangelicals. We just don't care that much about it, right? But when it was Bill Clinton, we cared a lot about it. And if it's somebody else that is on the other side of our worldview, we care a lot about it, right? But when it's our guy, we don't care about it. And I think the reason for it, and this is, again, the other part, and this is all, like, I want to be clear, this is not, I'm not making any political statements. I'm making discipleship statements. I'm making statements about how we carry ourselves in culture, the things we value or the things we devalue for goals that we want that are not Jesus-like goals. That's what I'm trying to get at here. And so I think the evangelical, or some evangelical loyalty and defense of and celebration of President Trump is basically related to the idea that he's kind of a thug, right? And they're tired of wokeism. They're tired of liberalism. They're tired of feeling like their lives are being undermined or devalued or disrespected or whatever it is. And where in that space, Jesus gives us very clear instruction of what we're supposed to do when we're in that kind of cultural space, right? Like the early Christians were in that kind of cultural space as well. And there's these reminders of loving your enemy and doing good to them and being peacemakers and not lashing out and overcoming evil by doing good and giving water to your enemy. And all these things that the New Testament highlights, I think there's many in conservative Christian evangelical spaces, they're looking at that and going, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. If anything, I just need to change the fabric of culture by finding a thug and having that thug punish all of these left woke enemies of mine, change the contours of culture, put us in charge, and then I can be more Christian for that, right? Like, that's kind of what's happening. And so, they're backing that a guy that has clearly said, like, I have an agenda to be vengeful. Like, he's saying that pretty consistently. Like, you put me in power, I'm going to be vengeful. And I'm like, Jesus talks about, this is not what we do. In fact, if anything, I think what you have is the equivalent of Jesus versus Barabbas. And there is a segment, that are saying, give us Barabbas. We want Barabbas. And if you go back to the story, Barabbas was an insurrectionist. Barabbas was kind of a terrorist to Rome. He was a thug. Like, that's what he was. And then Jesus is like this almost pacifist in comparison. So he gets arrested. Somebody busts out a sword and he says, put it away. You live by it, you die by it. And then Jesus willingly hands himself over to authorities, by which he is then tried and convicted. And now he's going to die, right? And the crowds got this option when Pilate says, which one do you want me to release to you? Because that's kind of the tradition of this time of year. I'm going to give you one of the criminals. And they're like, give us the thug. Don't give us the pacifist. Don't give us the one that's going to love his enemies. Give us the one who threatens his enemies, who wants vengeance on his enemies, who is here because he's killed his enemies, right? That's part of the problem for Barabbas. And so they're crying, give us Barabbas, give us Barabbas. And I think that's the same thing that's happening. I think what's happening is, in the name of a veil of religion in the name of a kind of a not Christ-centric Christianity, maybe a cultural Christianity, or maybe more to the point, a much more politically educated or maybe conservatively politically educated mindset is like the more the doctrine in place. And then from that, people are losing the Jesus values, but again, trying to do it in the name of Jesus, but they're saying, give us Barabbas so that we can accomplish the Christian stuff. We need a Barabbas to get it done. And I think that's the backing effect of President Trump. Like there's nothing that I can really see in backing him that somehow isn't like selling our soul a little bit to do it. You know what I mean? And again, I want to be clear. If you're of the persuasion that says, it's not the dude, I'm not supporting him, I don't defend him, I'm not proud of him, I'm not whatever, it's just he's the Republican guy and I go Republican. Great. 100%. You get a pass in my world. You really do. I'm really talking about more of this kind of, again, like this just strange, like real passionate support of, and without maybe some discernment, like going like, hey, as you're doing it, you are backing a person that does celebrate a lot of things that are very contrary to Jesus. Like he's known for a lot of things that are very contrary to Jesus. And so in that regard, just know what you're kind of signing on board with is somebody that flirts with things that kind of once out into the world are very tough to pull them back in. It kind of reminds me like a Pandora's effect, like the box is open and things are off to the races. But I think that's the other thing I'm seeing right now. There is a segment, not by any means do I mean all of my evangelical brothers and sisters, but there's a large segment that is even getting increasingly okay with like authoritarianism. They're getting okay with saying, you know what, if you got to violate the Constitution to establish the nationalism that we want, it's totally fine. So there's like the group that used to be very much about Constitution and very much about democracy and very much about freedom is suddenly very, very warm to the eradication of freedom for some, the eradication of democracy for some, the use of authoritarianism to secure the world they want, even if it costs others the world that they live in. Like all of those things are not the way of Jesus. They're just not the way of Jesus. Right. And this is probably where I have this more fundamental concern when people talk about Christian nationalism, or we talk about the radical support and defense of President Trump, or forcing a mandate that says you have to put the 10 Commandments in all schools in a state. Like all of those things, I think what it's doing is saying we want our kingdom in our way, here and now, as we define it. And it is at the deep cost and assault on the very kingdom that Jesus actually promotes and is trying to get us to live out in this world. Because when it comes to that, the tools are very different. It's not thuggery. It's not force. It's not vengeance. It's not mockery. It's not mean words. It's not, the things that are getting a little celebrated. It's not linking a guy that gets felonies for covering up an affair with a porn star and equaling it to how Jesus was mishandled in Pilate's courtroom. It's like, and I've seen those memes. I'm like, this should not be done. We should not be comparing the trial of Jesus and the trial of Trump. Like, honestly, it's foolhardy on our part. I know we think it's funny and it's a dig again at the libs or whatever else. It is costing witness. It is costing us our witness in radical, radical ways. It just is. And not just costing us our witness, it's also costing us our soul, because it's sinful. It like to celebrate these vices, to defend, celebrate, make jokey memes about it. It's corruptive to our own soul. It's corruptive to the fruit of the Spirit. It's more like the works of the flesh that are coming out in these ways that we speak of or defend or whatever, some of this content. And this is where, for me then, as a pastor, as a shepherd who is deeply passionate about the message of Jesus and the lifestyle of Jesus in particular, because I think it's the lifestyle that changes the lives of people around us and makes Jesus even more attractive to people. I think all of that is just getting run over, just massively run over. And so it hurts us and it hurts the people around us. It corrupts our soul and it turns their souls off to being open to Jesus. And so I just want to finish this up, right? I want to round it out. And I don't even know how much this has made sense today or not. is that I probably got too much stuff floating around in my mind right now. But when I see all of these things in play, I see this Christian nationalism stuff that is way more Old Testament focused than New Testament Jesus focused. I see the celebration of a candidate whose values are vices, and the vices are being esteemed as values by people that love, or at least claim to love Jesus and know Jesus, but they also know that Jesus would look nothing like that. But they have this desperation that says the way of Jesus will not fix our culture. We need a Barabbas. We don't need a Jesus. We need a Barabbas. We need a thug. We need somebody who's going to be authoritative, authoritarian, not so much diplomatic, but really just a little bit more like give the guy a sword and let him go. Like all of that stuff is harming our soul, harming our witness, and wanting to build a false kingdom that is not anything like Jesus. And this has been done before. Like that's the other thing I want to say. These kingdoms have been attempted before in the name of Jesus. Kingdoms have been built by the power of the sword. It only undermines the cross, undermines human dignity and value, and undermines the heart of the church, undermines the gospel in all of its range. The gospel has a lot of bandwidth to it, and almost all of that gets corrupted in these spaces. And so that's my plea, my warning, my sense of like, come on, everybody, let's see it like it is. Let's take off the blinders and not give into this stuff. Again, I don't care if you go R or D. That's not my thing. It is the tone, temperament, defensiveness of some of the stuff right now that we just got to do it different. We got to almost say like, yeah, you know what? These things are harmful. They're not good. They're bad. That is not the heart of Jesus. I want to publicly say that now. That is not the stuff of Jesus, right? Like when Donald Trump's son says, you know what, Jesus said, turn the other cheek, but that doesn't work today. We got to fight like hell. Like that should be for us as Christians going, that's a big problem. When you go, Jesus doesn't work, and so now we're going to fight like hell. I'm going to invoke hell as my tool of getting a thing done. We should be like, oh, maybe that's a problem. Like that's a thing right there. So what does work? How should we be doing this as everyday missionaries? Man, I think it means we have to go out of our way to be kind. We have to go out of our way to be compelling. We have to go out of our way to be servant-minded. We have to go out of our way to just almost like disrupt the stereotype and say, this is not what it's about. And I think one of the big things too is saying, hey man, we don't need this love affair with the old. We need to embrace the new. It's not old wineskins. It's new wine, new wineskins. And that is, man, my jam. Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, fruit of the Spirit, definition of love. Like we have to take those things seriously, and we have to have faith that those things actually work, because I think that's the other thing. We're losing faith that the way of Jesus works. We have more faith that the way of Barabbas or the way of the thug or the way of force, the way of mandate is what works. So we're saying compelling's out, right? And like warfare is in. No. Even the New Testament, when it uses metaphors of warfare, says, but our warfare is not like the style of the world. Like our warfare, you ready? Means we love our enemies instead of hate our enemies. Our warfare realizes that nobody in this world is our enemy. We have one enemy that is not in this world. He sets up the tone and temperaments of this world, and then we fall victim to those things. But no human being is our enemy, right? If we can believe that, if we can actually have faith that that's how Jesus changes things, man, this is, I think, even why Peter talks about hastening the coming of the day of the Lord. Like the way we hasten it is we live like Jesus, think like Jesus, act like Jesus, feel like Jesus, believe like Jesus. We do the stuff of Jesus, and that actually is the healing agent of the world. That's the kingdom advancement in the world. But when we start saying, in the name of religion, I'm going to go find a brute, and the brute is going to force my way of life on everybody else, or the nationalism effect, which is we just need to get control, reinstitute the Old Testament law so that we'll make all the sinners die or be beaten with sticks or whatever the punishments of the Old Testament. Like, if we think that's the way forward, it's only the way backward. It's only the way backward. So my heart, plea, appeal, desire, whatever you want to call it, is let's actually be like Jesus, right? Like Christian, like let's be Christ-an, like whatever exactly you could say it that way. But let's take that for a spin, right? And when we see these things, don't slip into the snarkiness of it all. Don't slip into the bitiness. Don't slip into the eye rolling. Don't slip into being informed more by political pundits than you are by Jesus. Like that's the thing, right? I think a lot of people spend a lot of time reading and hearing a lot of kind of reinforcing political stuff and very little time reflecting on the stuff of Jesus. And I think if we do that more and the other stuff less, man, in that space, we will be even more effective everyday missionaries.